The hiss of the steam engine was a monstrous, dying breath. It bled white vapor into the crisp, dry air, a ghost dissolving against a sky the color of faded denim. For 3 days, that sound had been the rhythm of Abigail Thorne's life, a churning, clattering pulse that had carried her away from everything she had ever known. Now, as the train shuddered to a final, groaning halt, the sudden silence felt louder than the noise it replaced. It was a hollow, ringing quiet that pressed in on her, amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. She stood, her muscles aching from the cramped confines of the passenger car, the worn wool of her traveling dress, a sensible gray that had seemed perfectly adequate in Kansas, now felt thin and foolishly out of place. Smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt with a trembling hand, she reached for the handle of her only possession, a scuffed leather satchel. Its sides were softened with age, the brass clasp tarnished, the handle worn smooth by her own grip and her mother's before her. Inside, it held 2 changes of clothes, a Bible, a small collection of books for teaching, and the letter, the brittle, hopeful piece of paper that had promised a new beginning in a town called Dust Haven. Abigail was the last one to step off the train. A few rough-looking men in dusty Stetsons and a weary family with 3 small children had disembarked ahead of her, melting quickly into the town's embrace. A man with a thick mustache had been there to meet the family, swinging the smallest child into his arms with a booming laugh that echoed briefly in the stillness. But for Abigail, there was no one. The platform was nothing more than a series of heavy wooden planks laid over a bed of gravel, stained dark with soot and oil. It ended abruptly, giving way to a wide, rutted expanse of dirt that served as the town's main street, Dust Haven. The name was an honest one, she thought with a flicker of grim humor. The wind, a constant low moan that swept down from the surrounding brown hills, lifted the fine, pale soil into the air, coating everything in a gritty film. It settled on her eyelashes, on the collar of her dress, and she could taste it on her tongue, the very flavor of the place. Her gaze swept over the town. It was a raw, unfinished settlement, clawed from the wilderness with wood and sweat. The buildings were unpainted, their pine boards already silvering under the relentless sun. A general store stood opposite the station, its windows displaying sacks of flour and bolts of calico. Next to it was a saloon, its swinging doors ominously still. Further down, she could see a blacksmith's forge, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on anvil, the town's only heartbeat. Beyond the sparse collection of buildings, vast, empty plains stretched to the horizon, dotted with the dark shapes of cattle. The newly laid railroad tracks, gleaming like silver ribbons, were the town's lifeline, the iron umbilical cord connecting it to the world she had left behind. They were also her only path of retreat, a thought that brought a cold knot of fear to her stomach. She clutched her satchel tighter. The letter had been from a Mr. Silas Croft, a man who identified himself as the town's mayor and proprietor of the largest cattle ranch. He had written of a need for a schoolteacher, for a civilizing influence for the children of Dust Haven. His words were formal, promising a modest salary and a room at the boarding house. He had assured her she would be met at the station. But Mr. Croft was not here. No one was. The station master, a gaunt man with a drooping mustache, gave her a brief, uninterested glance before turning his attention back to a crate he was levering onto a dolly. A few cowboys loitered outside the saloon, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats. They watched her, their eyes lingering with a frank, unnerving curiosity that made her feel like a strange insect pinned to a board. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin in a show of composure she was far from feeling. The train whistle blew a long, mournful blast. With a great chuffing of steam and a groan of metal, the engine began to move, the cars clattering past her, gathering speed. She watched it go, her last link to civilization, her last chance to change her mind, until it was just a dark smudge on the horizon, its smoke a fading plume in the vast, empty sky. When it was gone, The silence it left behind was absolute. It was the silence of being utterly and completely alone. And in that profound quiet, the memories she had been running from caught up to her. She saw Richard Sterling's face, as clear as if he were standing before her. She saw his handsome, confident smile, the one that had promised her a world of comfort and respectability in their bustling Kansas town. He was a banker's son, a man of prospects and polished manners. He had courted her with poetry and flowers, with gentle hands and whispered assurances of a future as bright and orderly as the tended gardens of his family home. She had believed him. She had allowed herself to dream of a life filled with books, music, and the quiet dignity of being Mrs. Richard Sterling. The dream had shattered just 6 weeks before their wedding day. The reason was as old and as common as the dust under her feet, another woman, the daughter of a wealthier merchant. A match deemed more suitable for a man of Richard's rising stature. He had told her with a regret that sounded practiced. His eyes not quite meeting hers, he spoke of practicalities, of family duty, of things a simple schoolteacher like her might not understand. But Abigail had understood perfectly. She understood the sting of public humiliation, the pitying glances from neighbors, the way her own mother couldn't look at her without her eyes filling with a disappointment that was sharper than any anger. She understood the crushing weight of a future that had vanished overnight. The world she had thought was solid ground had turned to quicksand beneath her feet. She had been left with nothing but a broken heart and a tarnished reputation. Staying in Kansas was impossible. Every street corner, every familiar face, was a reminder of her failure. So when she saw the advertisement for a teacher in a remote town in the West, it felt like a lifeline. It was a chance not just for a new life, but for an escape. An escape from the whispers, from the pity, and from the ghost of the woman she was supposed to have been. Now, standing on this desolate platform, the feeling of being discarded washed over her again, as sharp and cold as it had been in Richard's parlor. Had she merely traded one form of abandonment for another? The letter in her bag felt less like a promise and more like a cruel joke. Perhaps Mr. Croft had changed his mind. Perhaps the town had decided they didn't want a schoolteacher after all, especially not one from the East. The cowboy's stares felt less like curiosity and more like judgment. They saw what she was, an outsider, a stray, something that didn't belong. A gust of wind whipped a strand of her tightly pinned brown hair across her face. She pushed it back, her fingers cold. For a moment, a wave of despair so powerful it made her dizzy threatened to pull her under. She could get back on the next train. Of course, it would come through in 2 days, heading east. She could go back, admit defeat, and endure the shame. No. The word formed in her mind, hard and clear as a piece of flint. She had not come all this way, endured the discomfort and the fear, just to turn back at the first sign of hardship. She had survived Richard Sterling's betrayal. She would survive Dust Haven's indifference. The life she had wanted was gone forever, but the life she could make for herself was still a blank page. It would be written here, in this hard, unforgiving place, with ink of her own making. Taking a deep breath, Abigail centered herself. The air was thin and smelled of sagebrush and distant cattle. It was a clean, wild smell, so different from the damp, loamy scent of her Kansas home. It was the smell of something new. She shifted the weight of the satchel in her hand. It felt heavy, filled not just with her meager belongings, but with the entire weight of her past. But it was also all she had to build a future. With deliberate, measured steps, she walked to the end of the wooden platform. Her boots made a soft, uncertain sound on the planks. Then, she stepped down. Her heels sank into the soft dirt of the main street. It was an unsteady, grounding feeling. She was no longer a passenger, no longer in transit. She had arrived. She paused, looking down the street toward the boarding house mentioned in the letter. It was a long walk, and every eye in Dust Haven seemed to be upon her. She felt their silent appraisal, their doubt. An Eastern woman, A schoolmarm. They probably gave her a week before she fled back to where she came from. Let them watch, she thought, a spark of defiance igniting within her. Let them whisper. She had been left standing alone before, and she was still standing now. Straightening her spine, she began to walk, her head held high, into the heart of the town that had not wanted her, determined to make it her own. The boarding house was run by a woman named Martha Gable, a widow whose spine was as straight and unyielding as the wooden posts holding up her porch. She had appraised Abigail with a cool, gray-eyed stare, taken the promised payment for the first month's lodging, and shown her to a small, clean room at the top of the stairs. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a single window that looked out over a dusty alley. It was stark, but it was a space of her own. When Abigail had inquired about supper, Mrs. Gable had given a short, sharp nod. "I serve a meal at sundown. If you miss it, you fend for yourself." She had paused, her gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "The saloon's the only other place serves a hot plate after dark. Man who hired you. Mr. Croft. He's often there, if you're looking for him." Abigail had missed the meal. The emotional and physical toll of the day had caught up to her, and she had fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep, only to awaken to a room filled with the long shadows of dusk. Her stomach was a hollow ache, a gnawing emptiness that mirrored the loneliness in her heart. The thought of entering a saloon, a place she had been taught was the domain of rough men and loose morals, sent a tremor of fear through her. But the thought of going to bed hungry, of starting her new life with a retreat into weakness, was worse. And there was the chance of finding Mr. Croft, the man who held the key to her purpose here. Summoning the same reserve of courage that had carried her from the train platform, she put on her bonnet, tied the ribbon securely beneath her chin, and stepped out into the evening. The air had grown cold, and the wind now carried the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat. The clanging of the blacksmith's hammer had ceased, replaced by the tinny, distant sound of a piano. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as she approached the swinging doors of the saloon. For a full minute, she stood outside, her hand hovering near the wooden doors, her resolve wavering. She could see slivers of the scene within the warm, yellow glow of kerosene lamps, the hazy smoke that hung in the air, the dark shapes of men hunched over tables, taking a breath that did little to steady her nerves. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The music stopped. The low murmur of conversation died. It was as if she had walked into a tableau, every man frozen in place, turning to stare at the woman in the gray dress and sensible bonnet. The room was larger than she'd expected, with a long, polished bar running the length of one wall and a dozen round tables scattered across a sawdust-covered floor. It smelled powerfully of spilled ale, unwashed bodies, and tobacco smoke. The air was so thick she felt she could taste it. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor in front of her, her cheeks burning with the heat of their collective gaze. She walked towards the bar, her steps feeling clumsy and loud in the sudden, oppressive silence. The bartender, a burly man with a thick apron tied around his middle, watched her approach with narrowed eyes. "I was told you serve supper," she said, her voice coming out as a reedy whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing a note of confidence. "I'd like a plate, if you please, and I'm looking for Mr. Silas Croft." The bartender grunted, wiping a glass with a stained rag. "Croft ain't here tonight. Stew's all we got." He gestured with his head toward a small, empty table in the corner. 10 cents. She nodded, relieved to have a destination. She placed a coin on the bar, retrieved a plate of thick, savory-smelling beef stew, and made her way to the indicated table, acutely aware that the silence had been replaced by a low, rumbling hum of whispers. She sat with her back to the wall, hoping to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. She bowed her head, pretending to be absorbed in her meal, though the food felt like ash in her mouth. "Well, look what the wind blew in," a voice drawled from a nearby table. It was loud enough to carry, clearly intended for her to hear. A little sparrow, all the way from back east. A round of rough laughter followed. Abigail kept her eyes on her plate, her knuckles white where she gripped her fork. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. "She's a schoolmarm, I heard," said a second voice, belonging to a wiry man with a stained grin. His name was Pike. "Come to teach us heathens our letters. You reckon she knows how to spell skedaddle?" More laughter, louder this time. The first man, a heavy-set cowboy named Colby, pushed his chair back. "I don't know. Pike, she looks a mite too fragile for a place like this. A strong wind might just carry her right back to Kansas." Abigail's spoon clattered against her plate. Kansas. The name was like a physical blow, bringing back the sting of Richard's rejection, of the town's pitying stares. She felt the same hot shame rise in her, the same feeling of being judged and found wanting. She forced herself to take a bite of stew, the motion stiff and mechanical. Colby's boots scraped on the floor as he stood and ambled over to her table. He loomed over her, blocking the lamplight, casting her in his shadow. He smelled of sweat and cheap whiskey. "Evenin', ma'am," he said, his voice slick with false courtesy. "Don't you know a place like this ain't proper for a lady? A pretty little thing like you could get confused." She finally looked up, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of anger. "I am here for my supper, sir, that is all." Pike sauntered over to join his friend, leaning on the back of the empty chair at her table. "Oh, she can talk. Colby smart 1. 2. You think she can teach an old dog like me a new trick?" He winked, and Colby chuckled. They were playing with her, like two cats with a cornered mouse. The other men in the saloon were watching, some with amusement, some with indifference. No one moved to intervene. In this world, she was utterly on her own. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She was about to stand, to leave her meal and flee, when a third figure emerged from the deepest shadows of the room. He had been sitting in a corner so dark he seemed a part of it, a man she hadn't noticed when she first entered. He didn't rise quickly or with any sense of alarm. He simply unfolded himself from his chair, a slow, deliberate movement that was somehow more commanding than any sudden action. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a long, dusty leather duster that had seen years of hard use. His face was in shadow, hidden by the low brim of a worn, sweat-stained hat. He moved without a sound, his worn boots making no noise on the sawdust floor. He stopped beside Colby, and though he said nothing, his presence was a physical force. The air around him seemed to crackle with a quiet intensity. Colby, who had been leaning over Abigail's table, instinctively straightened up, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "She bothering you, boys?" the stranger asked. His voice was not loud, but it was deep, a low rumble like distant thunder. It cut through the saloon's stale air and seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Colby forced a blustering laugh. "Just making the new schoolmarm feel welcome." Jed, no harm in a little conversation. The man called Jed didn't move. He didn't even seem to be looking at Colby, his gaze directed somewhere into the middle distance. Yet every man at the table felt the weight of his attention. "Your conversation is over." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the flat finality of a closing door. Pike bristled. "Now hold on. Jedediah, we ain't done nothing wrong. No call for you to get involved." The stranger finally turned his head, just enough for the lamplight to catch his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. They were a pale, startling gray, and they held a stillness that was more intimidating than any open threat. It was the look of a man who had seen too much and was impressed by very little. It was the calm, steady gaze of a predator, or of a soldier who had stood on a battlefield and forgotten what it was to be afraid. He looked at Pike, and in that single, silent glance, Abigail saw the other man's bravado crumble. Pike swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, He took a half step back. "All right, Jed, all right, just having some fun." He and Colby exchanged a nervous look, then shuffled back to their table, their retreat clumsy and conspicuous. The tension in the room broke. Men turned back to their drinks. Conversations started up again, and the piano player tentatively began a new tune. It was over. The tall man stood there for a moment longer, then turned his gaze on Abigail. She expected to see pity, or perhaps the same veiled amusement she'd seen in the other faces. Instead, his expression was entirely neutral. His face was lean and weathered, carved by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long miles spent staring at the horizon. He looked tired, but it was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had settled in long ago. There was a scar, a thin white line that cut through his left eyebrow, a relic of some past violence. He was a man who, like the landscape outside, was hard and unforgiving, yet possessed a kind of stark, unadorned beauty. "You, the new teacher?" he asked, his voice softer now, but still with that gravelly edge. She could only nod, her own voice having deserted her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod in return. He looked at her half-eaten plate of stew. "Finish your meal, ma'am. No one else will trouble you." He turned and walked back to his corner, melting back into the shadows as if he'd never left. Abigail watched him go, her breath catching in her throat. She looked down at her hands and was surprised to find they were no longer trembling. She did as he said. She ate her stew, the warmth of it spreading through her, chasing away some of the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She was still aware of the other men, of Colby and Pike occasionally shooting sullen glances her way, but their words had lost their power. The stranger's quiet defense had built an invisible wall around her. He had not smiled at her. He had not offered comforting words or gallant reassurances. He had not treated her like a damsel in distress or a fragile flower to be protected. He had simply seen an injustice, a lack of balance in the room, and had righted it with a minimum of fuss. He had offered her not chivalry, but a kind of blunt, impartial respect. It was a form of kindness so stripped of pretense, so utterly without judgment, that she had never before encountered it. Richard's kindness had been a performance, a tool to win her affection. Her town's kindness had been conditional, evaporating the moment she became an object of pity. But this man, this stranger, named Jedediah, had asked for nothing and expected nothing. He had defended her right to eat her supper in peace simply because it was the right thing to do. For the first time since the train had pulled away from the station, leaving her alone on that desolate platform, Abigail Thorne felt a flicker of something that was not fear or defiance, but a fragile, tentative shoot of hope. She was a stranger in a strange land, but perhaps, she thought, it was not entirely without grace. The day after her arrival, Abigail met Mr. Silas Croft. He was not the distinguished, civic-minded gentleman his formal letter had suggested. He was a man made of leather and gristle, with a face tanned to the color of a worn saddle and hands that were thick, calloused, and permanently curled as if still holding reins. He found her in the boarding-house parlor, sizing her up with a practical, bovine gaze that held no trace of welcome or apology for his absence at the station. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice a low rumble. Croft had business with a rail shipment. There was no further explanation. He gestured for her to follow him outside. "I'll show you the school." Her heart, which had been fluttering with a nervous anticipation, sank. His brusque manner made it clear this was a transaction, not a calling. She was an employee, a hired hand for a job no one else wanted. The school was a derelict shack at the far end of the main street, leaning slightly to one side as if exhausted. It had once been a prospector's assay office, Croft explained, abandoned years ago. The single room inside was webbed with cobwebs thick as cotton batting. A thick layer of pale dust covered everything, muffling sound and dulling the light that filtered through a single, grimy window pane. There was no stove, no desks. Only a few splintered crates and a crippled table with one leg shorter than the others. "It'll need a woman's touch," Croft stated, his eyes sweeping the squalor without concern. "The lumber yard will give you scrap wood for benches on my credit. Anything else? You provide—" He then told her the names of a few families who had expressed interest: the blacksmith, a few ranch hands who lived with their wives on the edge of town, the laundress. They're rough children, but it's them or no one. $5 a month. He tipped his hat, a gesture devoid of courtesy, and left her standing in the doorway of the derelict building that was to be her new world. For a long moment, Abigail simply stood there, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of sunlight. Despair was a cold, heavy thing in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't a schoolhouse. It was a tomb for forgotten hopes. It was a perfect physical metaphor for her own life, a dilapidated, empty structure waiting to be filled with some kind of purpose. The old Abigail, the one who had planned floral arrangements for her wedding, would have wept, but the woman standing in the dust of Dust Haven was different. Grief had scoured her clean of certain illusions. She took off her bonnet, rolled up the sleeves of her dress, and set to work. The next few days were a blur of physical labor she was unaccustomed to. She swept and scrubbed until her back ached and her hands, soft from a life of turning pages, were raw and blistered. Mrs. Gable, the boarding house owner, watched her leave each morning and return each evening, covered in dust and sweat, with a non-committal expression. But on the third day, a bucket of hot water and a bar of lye soap appeared outside Abigail's door, a silent, practical offering that felt more like charity than kindness. She gathered her students. It was a humbling task. She went door to door, her Eastern dress and carefully articulated speech setting her apart. She met with mothers who were worn thin by work, their face etched with a permanent weariness. They looked at Abigail with a mixture of hope and deep-seated skepticism. She was promising their children a world of books and numbers, a world that seemed as distant and irrelevant as the moon. But she was also offering a safe place for them to be while their parents worked. For that reason alone, 4 mothers agreed. Her first class consisted of 6 children, ranging in age from 5 to 10. There was young Caleb, the blacksmith's son, a quiet boy with soot permanently ingrained in the lines of his hands. There were the Miller twins, Sarah and Beth, painfully shy girls with threadbare dresses who clung to each other. And there was Finn, a wiry, restless boy whose father was a farrier, and 2 younger children from a ranch hand's family. They were not, as Mr. Croft had warned, rough. They were quiet, watchful, and half wild, like fawns startled at the edge of a clearing. They had never held a book before. The concept of sitting still and listening was entirely foreign to them. Slowly, painstakingly, she began. She taught them their letters using a charred stick on a piece of smoothed pine board. She read to them from her own small collection of books, her voice filling the dusty room with tales of faraway places and heroic deeds. For a few hours each day, the dilapidated shack was transformed. It became a sanctuary, an island of quiet focus in the rough and tumble world of Dust Haven. Seeing the slow dawn of understanding in a child's eyes as they finally recognized the shape of their own name was a balm to her wounded spirit. It was real. It was meaningful. But outside the walls of her makeshift school, she remained an object of intense scrutiny. The town watched her every move. When she walked to the general store for supplies, conversations would hush as she entered, resuming in low whispers as she passed. She didn't have to strain to hear them. The words floated to her over barrels of pickles and sacks of beans. "Look at her. Walks like she's afraid the ground'll dirty her shoes. That dress won't last a week. One good dust storm and it'll turn to rags." She's an Easterner. They're a softer breed. No grit. Heard she ran from some kind of trouble back home. A man, most likely. That last whisper, overheard from 2 women sorting through bolts of calico, struck her with the force of a physical slap. Her face flushed with a hot, familiar shame. She had run They were right. They saw her not as a dedicated teacher carving out a new life, but as damaged goods. A woman with a past she was trying to escape. The judgment in their eyes was the same she had seen in Kansas, a corrosive pity mixed with a certain smug satisfaction at her misfortune. The old wound, the one left by Richard Sterling, tore open anew. At night, alone in her sterile room at the boarding house, the memories would return. She would lie in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and see Richard's handsome, dishonest face. She would hear the whispers of her former friends, dissecting her failure, speculating on her flaws. She had thought that by coming west, by putting 1,000 miles between herself and her past, she could escape that feeling of being weighed and measured and found wanting. But she had only traded one jury for another. Here, her perceived weakness was not a social failing, but a practical one. Here, they doubted her ability to survive. Some days, the loneliness was a crushing weight. She ate her meals alone at the boarding house, the silence at her table a stark contrast to the quiet camaraderie shared by the other boarders, a few permanent ranch hands and a traveling salesman. No one was overtly unkind, but there was a distance, a polite exclusion that kept her firmly on the outside. She was the schoolmarm, a necessary but foreign addition to the town's ecosystem. Yet there was a core of stubbornness in Abigail, a tensile strength that had been forged in the fires of her humiliation. She had been broken once, but she had not been shattered. Each whisper, each doubtful glance became a challenge. Her blisters hardened into calluses. Her back grew stronger. She learned to mend her own clothes, to cook a simple meal over an open fire when she worked too late to make it back for Mrs. Gable's supper. She learned the subtle language of the town, how a rancher's nod was a mark of grudging respect, how the blacksmith's wife leaving a small loaf of bread on her schoolhouse stoop was a gesture of profound support. One afternoon, as a fierce wind rattled the shack's poorly fitted window frame, young Caleb finally succeeded in writing his full name without assistance. He looked up at her, his face streaked with charcoal, his eyes shining with a pride so pure and bright it took her breath away. He had done it, and she had helped him. In that moment, the whispers of the town faded to an irrelevant background noise. The ghost of Richard Sterling seemed to retreat, his memory losing some of its sharp, painful power. Her life here was not easy. It was a daily struggle for purchase on a hard, unforgiving surface. But it was hers. She was not a fragile sparrow. As the cowboy in the saloon had jeered, she was a scrub oak, putting down roots in rocky soil, learning to bend in the wind without breaking. She was still an outsider, but she was no longer adrift. She was standing her ground. Weeks turned into a month. The brutal summer heat gave way to the crisp, golden days of early autumn. Abigail's life settled into a rhythm, dictated by the rising sun and the needs of her small flock of students. The children, once timid and watchful, had begun to open up to her, their laughter occasionally filling the dusty air of the little shack. She taught them to read from a worn copy of McGuffey's Reader and to cipher sums on pieces of slate. In them, she found a purpose that was solid and real, an anchor in the shifting sands of her new life. She had not seen the quiet cowboy, Jedediah, since the night in the saloon. His silent defense had become a strange, half-forgotten memory, a single moment of grace in an otherwise harsh introduction to Dust Haven. She had learned his name was Jedediah Kane, and that he was a man who kept to himself. He ran a small herd of cattle on a piece of land miles out of town, coming in only for essential supplies and leaving just as quietly. He was a ghost, a peripheral figure in the town's consciousness, and Abigail had begun to believe she might never see him again. Then the storm came. It rolled in from the west without warning, a bruised purple wall of cloud that swallowed the afternoon sun and plunged the world into a premature twilight. The wind hit first, a physical blow that shrieked through the cracks in the schoolhouse walls. Then came the rain, not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that hammered against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Inside, The children huddled together, their eyes wide with fear as the shack groaned and shuddered around them. Within minutes, the roof, which had always been a patchwork of hope and old timber, gave way. Water began to drip, then pour, in a dozen different places. One stream landed directly on their small stack of precious paper, turning the sheets to a pulpy gray mush. Another cascaded down the wall, creating a muddy river on the floorboards. Abigail moved quickly, shepherding the children to the driest corner, speaking to them in a calm, steady voice she didn't feel, trying to shield them from the worst of the deluge and their own terror. By the time the storm passed, leaving a clean-washed world steaming in the returning sun, the damage was done. The schoolhouse was a damp, muddy wreck, and a section of the roof gaped open to the sky, a wound in their small sanctuary. The next morning, Abigail was on a rickety crate, hammer in hand, trying to nail a loose piece of planking back over the hole. It was a futile effort. She was clumsy with the tool, and the wood was rotten, splitting under the force of her blows. The crate wobbled precariously with each swing. Frustration and a familiar sense of helplessness began to prick at her eyes. She was an educator, a woman of words and ideas, not a carpenter. A shadow fell over her. She paused, hammer held aloft, and looked down. Jedediah Kane was standing there, his dusty duster hanging on his tall frame, his hat pushed back slightly on his head. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable, his pale gray eyes squinting against the sun. He didn't say hello. He simply held out his hand. "Hammer," he said, his voice the same low rumble she remembered. For a moment, she was too surprised to move. Then, feeling foolishly inept, she handed it down to him. He tested its weight, then looked from the hole in the roof to the pile of scrap lumber she'd collected. Without another word, he walked to the nearby woodpile, selected a few solid-looking boards, and slung them over his shoulder with an ease that spoke of immense, casual strength. He returned, found a sturdier barrel to stand on, and began to work. Abigail slid off her crate, her task usurped, and simply watched. He moved with a quiet, powerful efficiency. There were no wasted motions, no hesitation. His hands, large and calloused, were surprisingly deft, measuring the wood with his eyes, setting the nails with two clean, forceful strokes of the hammer. He worked in a focused silence, his attention entirely on the task. It was the same intense, unwavering concentration she'd seen in his eyes in the saloon. She felt a strange compulsion to fill the silence. "The storm," she began, her voice sounding thin. It came up so fast, the children were frightened. He grunted in acknowledgement, not pausing in his work. "Happens. The sky out here can turn on you." She tried again. "I didn't expect... thank you for the help. I'm not very skilled with this sort of thing." He drove another nail home before glancing down at her. "Saw you were." The simple, unadorned truth of his statement left her with nothing more to say. She fell silent, watching the muscles in his back and shoulders move beneath his worn shirt. He was a part of this landscape, she realized, hard, quiet, and self-sufficient. While she was struggling to find her footing, he seemed as rooted as the stubborn, wind-swept pines on the hills. When he finished patching the main hole, he didn't stop. He moved across the entire roof, testing boards, pulling out rotten ones and nailing down new ones. His methodical work a silent rebuke of the shack's shoddy construction. Abigail busied herself inside, cleaning up the last of the mud and trying to salvage what she could of their supplies. But her awareness was constantly drawn to the man on the roof, to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his hammer. It was the sound of something broken being made whole. Hours later, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, he finally climbed down. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, leaving a streak of dust. The roof was a patchwork of old and new wood, but it was solid. "It'll hold," he said. It wasn't a boast, just a fact. I am in your debt, Mr. Kane, she said formally, feeling a need to mark the significance of his labor. He just shook his head, his gaze sweeping over the humble schoolhouse. He walked over to the water barrel and took a long drink from the dipper, the water tracing a clean path through the grime on his throat. She found her courage. You build things to last. A strange, humorless smile briefly touched his lips and vanished. He looked out at the vast, empty plains stretching away from them. Nothing lasts, ma'am. Not really. You just patch the holes for today. Hope it holds till tomorrow. His words were filled with a weariness that went far beyond the day's work. It was the philosophy of a man who had learned not to plan, not to hope too far into the future. That's a hard way to live, she said softly. He was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if watching a memory play out against the twilight sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and stripped of all emotion. Had a place once, down on the Santa Fe Trail. Built it myself. Good, solid house, stone chimney. Had a wife, Sarah, a boy, little Eli. He paused, and in the silence, Abigail could hear the echo of a life that was no more. We were heading west, same as everyone else, looking for a fresh start. He picked up a small stone, turning it over and over in his palm. Raiders came through at dusk. Wasn't lawmen they were after. It was wagons, families, easy targets. His voice became flat, a recitation of facts he had gone over 1,000 times in his mind. Fire, smoke. By the time the cavalry patrol found us the next morning, there was nothing left, nothing and no one left to hold on to. He tossed the stone away. So, no, ma'am, I don't build things to last. I patch holes. It's what I know how to do. The stark, brutal honesty of his story settled between them, a sorrow too profound for words. Abigail's own heartbreak, the polite, civilized pain of Richard's betrayal, seemed like a child's scraped knee in comparison. She thought of all the things one was supposed to say at a moment like this, words of comfort, of sympathy, but she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that such platitudes would be an insult to the enormity of his loss. So she said nothing. She simply stood there, a silent witness to his pain, her heart aching with a deep, vicarious grief. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes meeting hers. The guarded neutrality was gone. For the first time, she saw past the solitary cowboy, past the ex-cavalryman, and glimpsed the man underneath a man hollowed out by a loss so complete it had reshaped his entire world. In his gaze, she saw a flicker of shared understanding. He saw in her a fellow survivor, someone else who knew what it meant to have your world burn down around you, even if the flames were of a different kind. The air between them grew thick with unspoken things. It was a fragile, tentative connection, forged not in pleasantries or courtship, but in the shared, barren ground of pain and endurance. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and she had just seen him at his most exposed. He seemed to realize it, too. A shadow fell over his face, his mask of stoic indifference sliding back into place. He cleared his throat and nodded towards the roof. Should keep the rain out for a while. He turned to leave, his long strides eating up the ground, but after a few paces, he stopped and looked back at her. He stood there for a long moment, watching her as she stood in the doorway of her patched-up schoolhouse, the setting sun catching the red highlights in her hair. His eyes lingered, and in them, she saw a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't name regret, a deep-seated loneliness, and something else, something softer and more vulnerable that made her own heart ache in response. It was a look that said he was a man who had long ago decided to walk alone, but for the first time in a long time, was questioning the path. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the moment was gone. He gave a curt, final nod and walked away, disappearing into the deepening twilight without a backward glance. Abigail stayed in the doorway long after he was gone, the rhythmic sound of his hammer still echoing in the quiet chambers of her heart. The progress Abigail had made was as fragile as a spider's web, and just as easily torn. For a few weeks, a quiet truce seemed to settle over Dusthaven. The townspeople's stares became less hostile, their whispers less frequent. A few more children even joined her class, bringing the total to 8. She began to feel a delicate, tentative sense of belonging, the first green shoots of a life taking root in hostile soil. This fragile peace was shattered the day Bartholomew Bart Higgins rode into town. He was the owner of the vast Cross Creek ranch that sprawled across the county, a cattle baron whose wealth and influence were the invisible forces that shaped every aspect of life in Dusthaven. Abigail had heard his name spoken in tones of either fear or grudging reverence. Mr. Croft may have held the title of mayor, but Bart Higgins was the town's undeclared king. He did not look like a king. He was a thick, powerfully built man with a florid face and small, shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He dressed in a tailored frock coat and a clean, wide-brimmed hat, a stark contrast to the dusty, work-worn attire of the local cowboys. He rode a magnificent black stallion and was flanked by a half-dozen hard-faced men, a royal court on horseback. Among them, with expressions that were a mix of arrogance and subservience, were Colby and Pike, the 2 men from the saloon. Seeing them in Higgins's shadow, Abigail understood their behavior that first night had not been random unpleasantness. It was the casual cruelty of men who served a powerful master and felt entitled to their own small dominions of intimidation. Higgins and his men dismounted in front of the saloon, their presence immediately changing the town's atmosphere. People scurried out of their way. The usual lazy afternoon chatter ceased. Bart Higgins surveyed the street, his proprietary gaze sweeping over the buildings, the railroad, the cattle pens, and finally, settling on the small, patched-roof shack at the edge of town. His eyes narrowed, and he said something to Colby, who laughed and nodded. Abigail, watching from the doorway of the general store, felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. She had become a feature on his map, and he did not seem pleased by the new addition. The pressure began a few days later. It was a subtle, creeping poison. Colby and Pike became fixtures in the saloon and the general store, their voices always a little too loud, their words carefully chosen. They never addressed Abigail directly, but their talk was always for her benefit. "Heard that schoolmarm is filling the kids' heads with Eastern nonsense," Pike would say to the bartender. "Loud enough for the whole room to hear. Poetry and such. Won't do a boy much good when he's branding a calf or facing a stampede." "Higgins says a boy's place is learning a trade," Colby would add, leaning back in his chair. "Blacksmith's boy ought to be at the forge, not scribbling on a slate. Wastes good daylight." The words were like seeds of doubt, planted in the fertile ground of the town's pragmatism. Soon, Abigail began to see the results. Mr. Thompson, the blacksmith, stopped her on the street, his face a mask of worry. "Miss Thorne," he stammered, twisting his cap in his big, soot-stained hands. "Caleb, he's a good boy, and he likes the learning. But Mr. Higgins' foreman mentioned that my contract for shoeing the Cross Creek horses is coming up for review. He said Mr. Higgins values tradition. The unspoken message was clear: choose between your son's education and your family's livelihood." The next day, Caleb was not at school. His absence left a hole in the small classroom that felt vast and empty. Then the whispers turned sharper. Rumors began to circulate about the safety of the schoolhouse itself. "That roof Jed Kane patched looks shaky," someone would remark. "One good snowfall and the whole thing could come down on those children." It was a lie. The repair had been solid and true, but it was a fear that was easy to stoke. Sarah and Beth's mother pulled them from class next, her eyes filled with an apology Abigail knew she couldn't voice. Her small class of 8 shrank to 4. The remaining children were from families so poor and marginal that they were beneath even Higgins' notice. The joy she had found in teaching was now tainted with a constant, simmering anxiety. The town, which had briefly seemed on the verge of accepting her, had closed ranks again. She was an outsider once more, a pariah. The women in the general store would now turn their backs completely when she entered. The polite distance she had felt before had curdled into a palpable, hostile silence. She knew the source of the poison, but she felt powerless to stop it. Higgins wanted her gone. The school, and the small plot of land it sat on, was a minor but irritating flaw in his perfect dominion. It was a symbol of an outside world, of an authority that wasn't his own. By educating the children of the poor, she was creating the illusion of a future that didn't involve working for his ranch. She was a nuisance, and Bart Higgins was a man who tidied his affairs. One evening, as she was walking the lonely stretch of road between the schoolhouse and the boarding house, a rider emerged from the deepening shadows. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was one of Higgins' men, but as he drew closer, she recognized the lean frame and the quiet, steady way he sat a horse. It was Jedediah Kane. He reined in his horse, blocking her path. His face was grim in the fading light. "Miss Thorne." "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice unsteady. "I've been on a long drive," he said, getting straight to the point. "Just got back. Heard some talk in town. About you, about Higgins." She simply nodded, a lump forming in her throat. He leaned forward on his saddle horn, his pale eyes searching her face. "You need to understand what you're up against. This ain't like back east. Croft might be the mayor, but he can't sneeze without Higgins' permission. Every man in that saloon, every shopkeeper, every ranch hand, they either work for Higgins or they depend on him. He owns this town." "He's trying to drive me away," she said, the words barely a whisper. "He's turning the parents against me." "It's the land," Jedediah said, his voice low and serious. "That shack sits on a piece of ground with direct access to the rail spur. Higgins wants to build a new loading pen there. The school is in his way." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "He's a man who gets what he wants. He'll press the folks who have something to lose until they do his bidding. Then he'll move on to those who have nothing to lose, and his methods get rougher." He straightened up, his gaze sweeping over the dark, sprawling landscape that was Higgins's kingdom. "You need to be careful. There's the law they write in books, and then there's the law out here. Around here, the law is in the hands of the man with the gun, and Bart Higgins has the most guns." His words were not meant to frighten her, but to arm her with the truth. He was giving her a map of the battlefield, showing her just how outnumbered she was. The unspoken advice was clear leave. Flee before you get hurt. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the same choice she had made in Kansas. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. He was right. This was a fight she could not win. She was one woman against a tyrant who owned the world she lived in. Every instinct screamed at her to pack her bag. Get on the next train and never look back. She looked at Jedediah, at his weary, honest face. He expected her to run. The whole town expected her to run. They saw her as the weak, fragile Easterner, just as Richard Sterling had. They were all waiting for her to break. But as she stood there on that dusty road, the chill wind whipping at her skirts, she thought of the 4 children who were still waiting for her. She thought of Finn, who was finally learning to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. She thought of the 2 small ranch children who looked at her with an adoration that both humbled and fortified her. She thought of Caleb, forced to trade his slate for a blacksmith's hammer. She had been driven from her home once by whispers and shame. She had let another person's cruelty define her life. A quiet, unyielding resolution began to form in her heart. It was not a fiery, righteous anger, but a cold, hard certainty. "He thinks I'm a nuisance," she said, her voice gaining a strength that surprised her. A problem to be swept aside. Jedediah watched her, his expression unreadable but attentive. "I am not just a nuisance. Mr. Kane," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I am a teacher, and those children, the ones no one else cares about, they are my students." She took a deep breath. I will not abandon them. A flicker of something surprise, respect, perhaps something more passed through Jedediah's gray eyes. He had delivered his warning, laid bare the danger. He had given her the truth, and she had chosen to stand and face it. He said nothing for a long moment, simply holding her gaze. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Then you watch your back, Miss Thorne," he said softly. He nudged his horse with his heel and rode off, disappearing back into the vast, dark plains as silently as he had come. Abigail watched him go, then turned and continued her walk back to town. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer in control. She was no longer just a traveler, an outsider looking for refuge. She was a fixture, and she would not be moved. The days following her confrontation with Jedediah's warning became a trial of silent endurance. Abigail felt the full weight of Bart Higgins's displeasure, not as a direct assault, but as a suffocating absence of warmth and community. The town of Dust Haven, which had never fully welcomed her, now actively shunned her. Conversation stopped when she entered the general store. Mothers would pull their children a little closer as she passed on the street. She was an island, and the tide of public opinion, directed by an unseen hand, was eroding the shores of her resolve. Her 4 remaining students became her entire world. Their small triumphs were her only victories. She poured all her energy into the little schoolhouse, making it a haven of learning and quiet dignity, a fortress against the cold indifference that surrounded them. She saw Jedediah Kane only from a distance, a glimpse of a lone rider on a faraway ridge, a tall figure stocking up on supplies at the general store who would meet her eyes for a brief, loaded moment before turning away. He was a man who lived by a strict code of non-interference, and having given his warning, he seemed to have retreated back to the solitary life he had carved out for himself. She understood. He had his own ghosts to contend with. He could not be expected to fight hers as well. Yet, his absence was a palpable ache, a reminder of the one person in this town who had seen her not as a problem or a pity case, but as a person. One evening, as the autumn air grew sharp with the promise of winter, he sought her out. She had stayed late at the schoolhouse, grading her students' rudimentary lessons, and was walking back to the boarding house as the last light bled from the sky. He was waiting for her by the water trough at the edge of town, his horse drinking deeply. He didn't seem to be waiting for her, but she knew he was. "Miss Thorne," he said, his voice a low sound in the quiet twilight. "Mr. Kane." She stopped, her hand clutching the small stack of slates she was carrying. He reached into his saddlebag, his movement slow and deliberate. He pulled out an object wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. It was a book. "Found this, sorting through my things," he said, his tone gruff, almost dismissive, as if embarrassed by the gesture. "Thought your students might have a use for it." He held it out to her. It was not a gift offered with grace, but with a kind of reluctant necessity. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was calloused and surprisingly warm in the cool air. She unwrapped the oilcloth. The book was a small, thick volume of Shakespeare's tragedies. The leather cover was worn smooth in places, scarred and stained by time and weather. The spine was completely broken, the pages held together by a few stubborn threads. It looked as if it had been through a war. "It's the only one I kept," he said, looking away toward the horizon. "From my time in the cavalry. A man I knew, a scholar from back east. He'd read it to us by the fire. Seemed to think it explained things." Abigail opened the cover. The pages were yellowed and brittle, some stained with water, others with something darker she didn't want to identify. But they were all there. Inside the front cover, in faded ink, was a name: Jedediah Kane, 4th U.S. Cavalry. It was a relic from another life, a life where he had a name and a place in the world, before he became a ghost haunted by loss. A man who owned almost nothing was giving her his history. "The spine is broken," she said softly, tracing the frayed threads with her finger. "Aye," he said, "been that way for years." "But the pages are all here," she continued, looking up at him. The words came to her, simple and certain. "I have a needle and strong thread for mending clothes. I can fix it. I can make it whole again." He looked at her then, a long, searching look. In the dim light, she saw the surprise in his eyes, the flicker of an emotion he quickly suppressed. He had offered her a broken thing, a reflection of how he saw himself, and she had not seen it as damaged goods. She had seen the potential for it to be mended. "If you think it's worth the trouble," he said, his voice rough with an unnamed emotion. "Anything worth keeping is worth the trouble," she replied. That small act of repair became a bridge between their two solitary worlds. Over the next week, he found reasons to be in town as evening fell. He would appear at the schoolhouse door under the pretense of checking on his roof repair or to drop off a piece of kindling he'd gathered. He would never announce his intention to stay, but he would settle into a corner of the room while she worked at her small table, the warm glow of the kerosene lamp pushing back the gathering dark. She would work on the book, her small needle dipping in and out, carefully stitching the signatures of pages back together, reinforcing the tattered leather. He would sit in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a quiet communion. Sometimes he would clean a piece of his tack, the scent of leather and oil filling the small space. Other times he would just sit and watch the fire in the small stove she had managed to acquire. And they began to talk. The conversations were like a slow spring thaw, the words trickling out, hesitant at first, then flowing more freely. He told her stories of his time as a soldier, not of battles, but of the land. He spoke of the vast, silent beauty of the plains at dawn, of the feel of a good horse under him, of the simple camaraderie of men who depended on each other for survival. He spoke of everything but the fire and the smoke that had ended it all. In return, she told him of her life in Kansas, not of the shame of her broken engagement, but of the things that had shaped her before it. She spoke of her father, a thoughtful man who had taught her to love books, and of her childhood dream of having a school filled with light and laughter. She shared the small, simple pieces of her past, rebuilding herself in his eyes, not as the woman who had been left behind, but as the woman who had loved and dreamed. In the sanctuary of the small schoolhouse, surrounded by the quiet darkness, they were not the outcast schoolmarm and the reclusive cowboy. They were just Abigail and Jedediah, two people who had known profound loss and were cautiously, tentatively, reaching for a human connection in the wilderness. One evening, after she had set the final stitch in the book's new spine, he did not leave as usual. He lingered, watching her as she packed away her needle and thread. "The first snow will be here soon," he said, his voice quiet. "It's clearer out on the plains. The stars, they seem closer out there." He hesitated. A rare thing for him. "My land. It has a ridge that looks out over the whole valley. It's a good place to see from." It was the closest he could come to an invitation. "I would like that," she said, her heart giving a hopeful leap. The next evening, he was waiting for her with 2 horses. They rode out of town, away from the judgmental eyes and the oppressive silence, into the vast, open country that was his home. The prairie was a sea of dry, silver grass under a sky of deepening indigo. The silence here was different. It was not the empty silence of loneliness, but the profound, living quiet of the earth itself. He led her to the ridge he had spoken of. It was just as he'd described. The world fell away below them, the lights of Dust Haven a tiny, insignificant cluster in the immense darkness. Above them, the sky was a black velvet dome scattered with a brilliant diamond dust of stars. They built a small fire, its warmth a welcome comfort against the biting wind. They sat side by side, watching the flames dance. The repaired book lay between them. "He was a good man," Jedediah said suddenly, his voice soft. "The one who gave me that book, Captain Weatherby, he said Shakespeare knew the truth of things, that a man's heart is the only frontier worth exploring." He shook his head. He was killed at Shiloh. I suppose his exploring ended there. Or maybe it just began, Abigail said gently. Maybe he just moved on to a different frontier. Jedediah looked at her, his expression thoughtful. You believe in that and what comes after? I believe that what we build in this life matters, she replied. The kindness we show, the things we mend, that has to count for something. It has to last. Nothing lasts, he said, the old, weary refrain returning, but this time it sounded less certain. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending a shower of sparks up into the night. I'm a man who knows how to leave. It's the one thing I'm good at. When the army was done with me, I left. When my family was gone, I just kept moving. Never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. Roots are just something else to lose. His words hung in the cold, clear air. She saw his life laid out before her, a long, lonely road of departures, a life of constantly turning his back, of walking away, because it was less painful than being the one left behind. She looked at his profile in the firelight, at the hard lines of his face and the deep sorrow in his eyes. Her heart ached for him, for the man who had taught himself that the only way to survive was to never let anything matter again. With a courage born of the night's intimacy, she asked the question that had been forming in her heart for weeks. Her voice was barely a whisper, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Do you ever stay, Jedediah, instead of leaving? He went utterly still. The stick he was holding fell from his hand into the flames. He didn't turn to her, didn't speak. He just stared into the fire, his jaw tight, the silence stretched, becoming a vast, empty space between them. She thought he would not answer, that she had pushed too far, broken the fragile trust they had built. But then she saw it, in his eyes, reflected in the firelight. A battle was being waged. She saw the familiar, haunted shadow of the man who always rides away. The man who patches holes but never builds. But beneath it, she saw something else flicker to life, something new and startling. It was a terrifying, brilliant spark of longing. It was the image of a man seeing a door he had long believed to be sealed shut. Suddenly creak open. It was the dawning, agonizing possibility of a different path. He did not answer her question, but in the depths of his unguarded eyes, she saw the unspoken, earth-shattering answer for the first time in a very long time. He was considering it. The quiet intimacy they had shared on the ridge felt like a dream from another lifetime. The reality of Dust Haven, with its sharp edges and hostile glances, returned with the morning sun. But something had changed. The fragile connection forged in the starlight now existed between them, an invisible thread that pulled taut across the distance. It was a shared secret, a silent acknowledgement that neither of them was entirely alone anymore. This newfound hope, however, was a delicate seedling, and the sky was already gathering its forces to obliterate it. The first sign of the storm was an unnatural stillness. The constant, sighing wind that was the prairie's natural breath died completely. The air grew heavy, thick, and smelled of ozone and damp earth. A strange, yellowish light bathed the town, leaching the color from the landscape and casting long, distorted shadows. By midday, a bruised, purple-black wall of cloud had consumed the western horizon, advancing not with the speed of a normal weather front, but with the slow, inexorable menace of an invading army. By the time Abigail dismissed her students, sending them scurrying home to the anxious calls of their parents, the first fat, cold drops of rain were beginning to fall. The sky opened moments later. This was not the cleansing rain that had followed the summer squall. This was a deluge, a violent assault. Water fell in blinding, horizontal sheets, driven by a wind that rose from a moan to a furious, shrieking howl. The world beyond the boarding house window dissolved into a churning gray chaos. The street, usually a river of dust, transformed into a torrent of thick, brown mud. The small creek at the edge of town, normally a placid ribbon of water, began to swell and roar, its voice a hungry growl. From her window, Abigail watched with a growing sense of dread as the water crept higher and higher, swallowing its banks, carrying with it debris branches, a broken fence post, the dark, bloated shape of a lost calf. The schoolhouse, her small, hard-won sanctuary, was directly in the storm's path. She could barely see it through the maelstrom, but she imagined the wind tearing at Jedediah's careful patchwork, the rain pouring through the gaps, turning her books and slates into a muddy ruin. Her heart ached for the loss of the physical space, but a deeper, colder fear was for the man who had repaired it. Jedediah was out there somewhere, alone in his small cabin on the plains, exposed to the full, untamed fury of the storm. Night fell, but the darkness was absolute, punctuated only by jagged blue-white flashes of lightning that illuminated a world gone mad. The storm did not abate. It intensified. The entire boarding house groaned under the assault. Sometime after midnight, the roar of the creek became a deafening, thunderous crash. Mrs. Gable, her face grim, came to Abigail's door. "The creek's broken its banks proper," she announced, her voice tight. "It's a flash flood. God help anyone caught out in it." Abigail's blood ran cold. She spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair by the window, staring out into the impenetrable blackness, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. She prayed for her students, for the town, and with a desperate, fervent intensity that frightened her, she prayed for Jedediah. The storm finally broke just before dawn. The wind died to a whisper, and the rain softened to a miserable drizzle. As the first weak, gray light of morning filtered through the clouds, the full extent of the devastation was revealed. The main street was a quagmire of mud and debris. The creek had receded, but it had left a wide, ugly scar of destruction in its wake. Several smaller outbuildings had been swept away, and the low-lying cattle pens were a wreck of splintered wood. Abigail threw a shawl over her head and plunged into the muck, her boots sinking to the ankle. She had to see the school. As she neared the edge of town, her worst fears were realized. The little shack was still standing, but barely. A large section of the roof had been torn away, and the building was listing heavily, its foundation undermined by the floodwaters. It was a ruin. But as she drew closer, a different kind of fear seized her. A thin, unnatural curl of smoke was rising from the back of the building, and through the driving drizzle, she saw a faint, flickering orange glow from within. It wasn't lightning. It was fire. Forgetting all caution, she began to run, her skirts heavy with mud, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she rounded the corner of the building, she saw them, Colby and Pike. They had a lantern and a can of kerosene. A small fire was already licking at a pile of dry timber they had pushed against the back wall. The storm had provided the perfect opportunity. In the chaos of the flood, who would question a fire? It would be an act of God, a final, decisive blow to drive her away for good. "What are you doing?" she cried, her voice ragged. They turned, their faces illuminated by the flames they had set. There was no surprise, no shame, only a kind of smug, vicious satisfaction. "Just cleaning up. Schoolmarm," Pike sneered, holding the lantern aloft. "This old shack is a hazard. Doing the town a favor." "Mister, Higgins wants this land cleared," Colby added, his big frame blocking her path. "And you've been a real nuisance. It's time for you to go, one way or another." He took a menacing step toward her. Abigail stood her ground, her terror momentarily eclipsed by a wave of pure, cold rage. "You will not do this." Colby laughed, a low, ugly sound. "And who's gonna stop us, you?" "She ain't alone." The voice came from the gloom, and it was as solid and unyielding as granite. 3 figures emerged from the drizzling rain. Mr. Thompson, the blacksmith, his massive shoulders hunched, a heavy smithing hammer held loosely in one hand. Mrs. Gable from the boarding house, her face a thundercloud, holding a heavy cast-iron skillet like a weapon, and behind them, looking like a wraith who had materialized from the storm itself, was Jedediah Kane. He was soaked to the bone, his duster caked in mud, a fresh cut bleeding on his cheek. He looked as if he had wrestled the storm itself and barely won, but his pale gray eyes were steady, and they were fixed on Colby and Pike with a chilling, absolute focus. Pike's sneer faltered. "Kane, this ain't your concern." "You're on her land," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You're threatening her. That makes it my concern." He took a step forward, and it was the most menacing movement Abigail had ever seen. The fight, when it came, was a brutal, clumsy affair in the mud and the rain. Pike, regaining a sliver of bravado, lunged at Jedediah with a knife. Jedediah moved with a speed that was startling, deflecting the attack, his hand striking Pike's wrist with a sharp crack. The knife flew into the mud, and Pike staggered back, clutching his arm, his face white with pain. Colby was a different matter. Bellowing with rage, he kicked at the fire, sending a heavy, burning piece of timber spinning through the air. He grabbed it, wielding it like a club, the burning end hissing in the rain. "Mr." Thompson moved to intercept him, but Colby was a bull, swinging the heavy brand with a wild, reckless force that drove the blacksmith back. He turned his attention back to Abigail, his eyes filled with a furious hatred. "This is all your fault," he roared, and lunged toward her. The burning timber held high. Everything happened in a heartbeat. Jedediah shouted her name. She saw him move, not toward Colby, but toward her. He shoved her hard, sending her stumbling back into the mud. Out of the path of the swinging brand, he put himself where she had been standing. The burning timber crashed against his side and arm with a sickening thud. Jedediah grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and staggered but did not fall. The sleeve of his duster smoldered and smoked. Before Colby could swing again, Jedediah lunged forward, ignoring the fire, and drove his fist into the bigger man's jaw. Colby's head snapped back, and he went down hard in the mud, the timber flying from his grasp. Seeing his partner fall, Pike scrambled to his feet and fled, disappearing into the gray morning. Colby, groaning, pushed himself up and followed, leaving only the smell of smoke and violence hanging in the air. The danger was over. "Mr." Thompson kicked the smoldering embers apart. "And Mrs." Gable doused them with a bucket of rainwater, but Abigail saw none of it. Her world had narrowed to the tall, swaying figure of Jedediah Kane. "Jedediah," she breathed, scrambling to her feet. He leaned against the wall of the shack, his face pale beneath the grime. "It's nothing," he grunted, but his arm hung limp at his side, and she could see a dark, bloody gash where the brand had struck. The smell of seared cloth and something else, something terrifyingly organic, filled the air. She rushed to his side, her hands fluttering uselessly, not knowing where to touch. "You're hurt. You're burned." "I've had worse," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. She reached out and gently touched his uninjured arm, her fingers trembling. And, in that moment, as she looked at his pale face, at the blood on his sleeve, at the man who had placed himself between her and a burning log without a second's hesitation, a new and terrifying emotion washed over her. It was a fear that had nothing to do with storms or villains or the loss of her school. It was sharper, colder, and infinitely more profound. It was the terrifying, heart-stopping fear of seeing the one solid thing in her world break. It was the fear of watching the quiet strength she had come to depend on falter. It was the fear of being left truly alone again, not by circumstance, but by the finality of death. For the first time, looking at the man who had become her anchor, Abigail Thorne was afraid of losing him. In the aftermath of the fire and the fight, the physical storm was replaced by a social one, a tempest of whispers and accusations that was, in its own way, far more destructive. Bart Higgins's henchmen had been driven off, but they had left a smear of poison that quickly infected the entire town. The narrative of the event was twisted with a breathtaking speed and malice. It was no longer a story of a brave teacher defending her school or of a few honest folk standing up to bullies. In the telling and retelling in the saloon and over the fence posts of Dusthaven, it became a sordid tale, the reclusive, dangerous cowboy. Jedediah Kane had gotten into a brawl over the new schoolmarm. The incident at the schoolhouse was not an attempted arson. It was a lover's quarrel, a violent dispute over a woman of questionable character. Why else would a man like Kane, who kept to himself for years, suddenly appoint himself her protector? Why else would she be tending to his wounds now? Behind the closed doors of the boarding house, the word they used, whispered from behind gloved hands and over the tops of teacups, was improper. It was a small, prim word, but it carried the weight of a guillotine. Mrs. Gable, with a grim set to her jaw that dared anyone to question her, had installed Jedediah in a small, unused room at the back of the boarding house. She had seen the burn on his arm and the deep gash on his side and declared, "He's not moving from this house until he can sit a horse without passing out. I'll not have it said." Martha Gable turns away a man injured defending what's right. Her declaration was a rock thrown against the tide of gossip, but the tide was too strong. For Abigail, the shunning became absolute. Before, she had been an object of suspicion, an outsider. Now, she was a source of scandal. When she walked to the general store, a hush would fall, and the women would gather in a tight, judgmental knot. Their backs turned to her as if she carried a contagion. She was no longer just the fragile Easterner. She was the fallen woman, a source of trouble who had brought violence and impropriety into their midst. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, prickling sensation on her skin that was achingly familiar. It was the same shame she had felt in Kansas, the same feeling of being publicly tried and convicted without a defense. But this was crueler. In Kansas, she had been guilty of a broken heart, of being naive. Here, she was being condemned for an act of courage, for a bond of kindness that the town's small, bitter minds could only interpret in the basest of terms. She spent her days tending to Jedediah. His injuries were severe. The burn on his arm was deep and painful, and the blow from the timber had left him with what Mrs. Gable diagnosed as at least 2 broken ribs. He bore the pain with a stoic, infuriating silence, his jaw tight, his eyes clouded with a torment that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. He would lie on the narrow cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of the town outside the window. He heard the whispers. He saw the way Mrs. Gable's other boarders would fall silent when Abigail entered the room with a tray of food or a basin of clean water. He saw the strain on Abigail's face, the dark circles under her eyes, the proud, defensive set of her shoulders as she moved through a world that had become hostile territory. And he knew, with a certainty that was a cold, hard weight in his gut, that he was the cause of it all. He was a magnet for trouble, a walking ghost who tainted everything he touched with the shadow of his own past. He had spent years building walls, keeping the world at a safe distance, precisely to avoid this. And in a few short weeks, he had not only failed to protect himself, he had dragged this decent, brave woman down with him. The thought was a sharper pain than the fire on his arm. One afternoon, nearly a week after the fight, she was changing the dressing on his burn. Her touch was gentle, her movements efficient, but he could see the tremor in her hands. "They're saying I'm the reason you were hurt," she said, her voice low, her eyes fixed on her work. "They're fools," he grunted, wincing as she applied the salve. "They're saying that we are involved," she managed, the word catching in her throat. Jedediah was silent. He looked at her bent head, the careful concentration on her face. He saw her not as the town saw her, but as the woman who had mended his book, who had looked at his broken past and offered not pity, but understanding. And he knew what he had to do. It was the only thing he had ever been good at. It was the only gift he had to give her. "I'll be well enough to ride in a day or 2, he said, his voice flat. She looked up, startled, her eyes wide with a sudden, nameless fear. "You're not well enough. You can barely sit up." "I'm well enough," he insisted. "I've ridden with worse." He finally met her gaze, his own eyes a bleak, gray landscape. "I'm leaving. Abigail." The name, her name, on his lips for the first time, was both an intimacy and a farewell. It struck her like a blow. "Leaving," she whispered, "leaving Dust Haven." "It's for the best," he said, his voice hard, reciting a line he had practiced in the long, dark hours of the night. "As long as I'm here, Higgins won't stop. The town won't stop. They see you with me, and they see trouble. If I'm gone, the trouble leaves with me. They'll forget. They'll leave you be." He was offering her a sacrifice, a noble retreat. He was trying to save her. But all she could hear was the echo of 1,000 other goodbyes, the finality of a closing door. She saw a long, lonely road stretching out before him, and an equally lonely one for herself, left behind to face the quiet ruin of what they had almost built. She finished tying the bandage, her movements now sharp and angry. She stood up, her back straight, her hands clenched at her sides. "So that is your solution," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, fierce intensity. "To run, to ride away and leave me to deal with the mess, the same way you've ridden away from everything else." He flinched as if she had struck him. "I'm doing this for you," he said, his voice rough. "To protect you." "Protect me." Her laugh was a brittle, broken sound. "You think your leaving protects me? Your leaving is the worst thing that could happen. Your leaving proves them right. It tells this whole town that I'm a woman who gets involved with men who abandon her. It validates every whisper, every sneer. It makes me the fool they all think I am." He tried to sit up, his face pale with pain and shock. "That's not—" "Isn't it?" She cut him off, stepping closer to the cot, her eyes blazing. "I came to this town because I was left behind. I was discarded because I wasn't good enough, because another choice was more practical. I came here to build something that was mine, something no one could take away. And I have been fighting for it every single day. I have faced down their scorn and their whispers and their threats. I have been stared at and judged since the moment I stepped off that train." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her voice dropping, becoming raw with a vulnerability that was more powerful than her anger. "I'm used to being stared at. Jedediah." She looked directly into his eyes, and he could not look away. "I'm just not used to seeing you turn your back." The words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. He stared at her, his defenses crumbling, the hard-won philosophy of a lifetime of flight shattering against the simple, devastating truth of her words. He had thought leaving was an act of strength, a selfless gesture. She was showing him it was an act of cowardice, a retreat. It was an abandonment not just of the town or the fight, but of her, of them. "Staying is harder," she whispered, her anger spent, leaving only a vast, aching sorrow. "Staying means facing them, together. It means enduring the whispers and proving them wrong. Leaving is easy. It's what you've always done. But I am asking you, for the first time, to do the hard thing. I am asking you to stay." She held his gaze for a long moment, her heart in her eyes, her entire future hanging on his answer. Then, without waiting for one, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the ruins of his oldest and most trusted conviction that the only way to save someone was to leave them behind. The saloon was not a courtroom, but on that bleak, gray afternoon, it served as one. Nearly every man in Dust Haven was crowded inside, their bodies packed together, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, cheap whiskey, and simmering tension. They were there to witness a trial, though there was no judge and the verdict had been all but decided before the proceedings began. The fate of the schoolhouse, and of its teacher, was to be sealed. Abigail stood at the very back of the room, near the swinging doors, a solitary island in a sea of rough-hewn masculinity. Mrs. Gable stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her presence a small, solid bastion of support in the hostile territory. Abigail felt the weight of 100 gazes upon her. They were not curious anymore. They were hard, accusatory, and weary. She was the source of the town's disruption, the stone thrown into their stagnant pond, and they were tired of the ripples. At the front of the room, behind a makeshift table, sat Silas Croft. He looked uncomfortable in his role as arbiter, constantly glancing to his side, where Bart Higgins sat with the relaxed, proprietary air of a man in his own parlor. Higgins was the true judge, jury, and, Abigail suspected, executioner. His men, including a sullen-looking Colby, were scattered strategically through the crowd, their presence a silent reminder of where the real power lay. Croft cleared his throat, the sound loud in the tense quiet. "We're here today," he began, his voice strained, "to discuss the matter of the old assay office, currently being used as a school." He shuffled some papers he didn't look at. "There have been concerns about its structural integrity after the flood, and about recent events." Higgins held up a hand, a gesture of casual command that immediately silenced Croft. "Let's not mince words." "Silas," Higgins said, his voice smooth and reasonable, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He rose to his feet, his gaze sweeping over the assembled men. "Gentlemen," he began, "I am a man who believes in progress. This town, our town, is on the cusp of prosperity. The railroad is our future. To that end, I have been in negotiations to expand our shipping capacity. A new, larger loading pen, right by the rail spur, would mean we can ship more cattle, faster. It means more money in every pocket in this room." He let that sink in, a promise of shared wealth that was a potent lure. "The ideal location for this new pen, for our town's future, is the piece of land where that dilapidated shack currently sits." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the school, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "Now, I was willing to wait, but the events of the past week have forced my hand. The structure is clearly unsafe. Worse, it has become a magnet for trouble." His eyes flickered toward Abigail, a look of cold condescension. "We've had violence, brawling, a woman of questionable associations bringing conflict to our doorstep." A low murmur went through the crowd. Higgins had expertly woven his own greed into a narrative of civic concern and moral outrage. "I propose a simple solution," he continued, his voice hardening. "The town council will condemn the building as unsafe. The land will revert to public domain, and I will purchase it at a fair price to build the new loading pen for the good of all. As for Miss Thorne," he paused, letting his gaze fall on her fully. "Her services are clearly no longer required. Her experiment in education has failed. She has brought us nothing but division and strife." He sat down. The silence that followed was heavy, final. He had presented his case, and there was no one to argue against it. He had offered them prosperity in one hand and a scapegoat in the other. It was an irresistible combination. Croft looked out at the faces, searching for a dissenter and finding none. "Does anyone have anything to say in the matter?" he asked, his voice betraying his hope that no one would. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the public humiliation, the final, formal casting out. She was being erased. She thought of the children, of Caleb's proud smile, of the trust in Finn's eyes. A wave of despair washed over her, so powerful it threatened to buckle her knees. Where was Jedediah? He had not been in his room that morning. She had allowed herself a sliver of hope that he had stayed, but his absence now felt like a final, bitter answer to her plea. He had done the thing he was best at. He had left. She was alone. "Well then," Croft said, a note of relief in his voice, "if there's no objection, we'll move to a vote." The swinging doors of the saloon crashed open, banging against the interior walls. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, carrying with it a flurry of dead leaves. Every head turned. Leaning heavily on a crude wooden crutch, his face pale and tight with pain, stood Jedediah Kane. He was not the avenging hero of a dime novel. He looked like a man who had crawled from his own sickbed. His clothes were rumpled. His left arm was bound tightly to his chest in a sling, and every movement was a study in controlled agony. But his eyes, those pale, steady gray eyes, were alive with a fire that seemed to hold all his strength. A collective gasp went through the room. Higgins's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, tightened into a scowl of pure fury. Jedediah moved slowly, deliberately, into the room. The thump of his crutch on the floorboards a funereal drumbeat in the sudden, absolute silence. He did not stop until he was standing in the open space in front of Higgins's table, directly between the cattle baron and Abigail. He ignored Higgins completely, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townspeople. "I hear you're talking about a fight," he said, his voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the room. "I was in that fight, so let me tell you what happened." He looked directly at the blacksmith. "Mr. Thompson, it wasn't a brawl. It was two of Higgins's men trying to burn down the schoolhouse with kerosene while Miss Thorne was inside." Another murmur, this one shocked and uncertain. Thompson's face paled. "Higgins talks about progress," Jedediah continued, his voice gaining strength, "but what he means is his own profit. He talks about safety, but he sent his men to commit arson. He talks about impropriety, but the only improper thing I see is a rich man trying to steal a piece of land from a woman who has nothing. A woman who has done more for the children of this town in 2 months than he's done in 10 years. He finally turned, his body moving stiffly, to face Higgins. The cattle baron rose slowly to his feet, his face florid with rage. "You're a liar, Kane, a broken-down drifter with nothing to his name." "I've got my name," Jedediah said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. "And I've got my word, which is more than I can say for you." He planted his crutch firmly on the floor and shifted his weight. A man taking his stand. He looked from Higgins back to the crowd. "This isn't about a loading pen. It's about a bully who can't stand to see one small thing in his world that he doesn't own." He drew a breath, and his next words were a solemn vow. "If you want this land, you'll have to come through me." The challenge hung in the air, audacious and absolute. A lone injured man against the most powerful force in the county. It was madness. And in that moment, seeing him stand for her, broken and bleeding but unyielding, Abigail found the last reserve of her own courage. The fear was still there, a wild bird fluttering in her throat, but her resolve was a cage of iron around it. He would not stand alone. She stepped forward, moving through the crowd that parted for her as if she were a specter. She came to a halt beside Jedediah, her shoulder almost brushing his good arm. She was trembling, but when she spoke, her voice was clear. "I was abandoned once," she said, her eyes finding Mr. Thompson's in the crowd. "I was told I wasn't worth fighting for. I will not do that to these children." She turned her gaze to the other men whose children she had taught, whose wives had offered her small, secret kindnesses. "Your children deserve a chance to read, to write their own names, to imagine a world bigger than this town. That is what I have tried to give them. That is what this school, this small, broken-down shack, represents." Her voice grew stronger, filled with a passion that came from the very core of her being. "Mr. Higgins is right about one thing. I am a nuisance. I am a nuisance to ignorance. I am a nuisance to bullies. And I will not be swept aside. I will not abandon these children. You can vote to take this land, but you cannot make me leave them." A profound silence fell over the room. The two of them, the broken cowboy and the disgraced schoolmarm, stood together against the king. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, a chair scraped against the floor. Mr. Thompson, the blacksmith, a giant of a man with a face full of shame and newfound resolve, stood up. "My boy, Caleb," he said, his voice a low rumble. He learned to write his name in that school. He was proud. I was proud. He looked at Higgins, his expression hard. I let you frighten me. Mr. Higgins, no more. The school stays. Then, from the back, Mrs. Gable's sharp, clear voice cut through the room. Miss Thorne is a decent, God-fearing woman, and Jedediah Kane is an honorable man. I've seen the proof of it. Anyone who says otherwise is a liar or a fool. The spell was broken. The monolithic wall of fear and intimidation that Higgins had built began to crumble. Men started looking at each other. Not at Higgins. A ranch hand whose daughter was in Abigail's class stood up. Then another. They didn't speak, but their posture, their silent refusal to look away from Higgins, was a vote in itself. Bart Higgins saw it. He saw his power, which had seemed so absolute moments before, evaporating in the face of two people's courage and a town's stirring conscience. His face went from red to a mottled purple. For a moment, he looked as if he might order his men to violence, but he saw the shift in the room. He had lost. For today. Fools, he spat, his voice thick with venom. You're all fools. He turned and stormed out of the saloon, his men trailing behind him like a pack of chastened dogs. In the quiet that followed, Abigail finally allowed herself to breathe. She looked at Jedediah, who was leaning heavily on his crutch, his face beaded with sweat from the effort of standing. He looked back at her, and in his exhausted, pain-filled eyes, she saw an unwavering strength and a deep, abiding tenderness that made her own heart ache. They had not won the war, but they had won the battle, and they had done it together. The exodus of Bart Higgins and his men left a vacuum in the saloon, a void filled not with cheers or celebration, but with a profound, collective intake of breath. The men of Dust Haven stood in the sudden quiet, blinking, as if emerging from a long, dark tunnel into an unfamiliar light. They looked at each other, then at the two figures standing alone in the center of the room, the pale, injured cowboy leaning on his crutch, and the schoolteacher, trembling but resolute, at his side. The town's long-held allegiance, built on fear and economic necessity, had been shattered by a simple, undeniable act of courage. Mr. Thompson, the blacksmith, was the first to move. He walked forward, his heavy boots loud on the floorboards, and stopped in front of Jedediah. He was a man of few words, his emotions forged and hammered into a gruff exterior. He simply stuck out his massive, soot-stained hand. "Kane," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was wrong. I let that man's money make me a coward." Jedediah looked at the offered hand, then at the blacksmith's honest, ashamed eyes. He shifted his crutch and took the hand with his own, the grip firm. "You stood up when it counted. Thompson, that's all that matters." It was a pardon, and it broke the dam. One by one, men shuffled forward. They didn't offer eloquent speeches. They offered a gruff word of thanks, a nod of respect to Jedediah, a shy, deferential glance at Abigail, a ranch hand whose children she had once taught promised a load of fresh lumber from his own stand of pine. The farrier offered his skill with a hammer and nails. Men who had whispered behind her back now met her eyes with a look of grudging, hard-won respect. She was no longer a nuisance or a scandal. She was their teacher, the woman who had faced down the tyrant they had all feared. The immediate concern, voiced by Mrs. Gable, who pushed through the crowd, was Jedediah. He was swaying on his feet, the adrenaline that had fueled him now gone, leaving only pain and exhaustion in its wake. With Thompson on one side and another rancher on the other, they half carried him from the saloon, back to the quiet of the boarding house. Abigail followed, her mind a whirlwind of relief and disbelief. As she stepped out into the gray afternoon, she saw that the news had already spread. Women were standing in the doorways of their homes, their expressions no longer hostile, but filled with a quiet, wondering awe. A new story was being written in Dust Haven, and for the first time, she felt like she was a part of its pages, not just a footnote. The next morning, The town began to build. It started with the promised load of lumber from the rancher, arriving at dawn. Then came Mr. Thompson, his forge temporarily silent. His hammers now intended for construction, not horseshoes. The farrier arrived, and then 2 more men. They descended on the ruined shack not as a demolition crew, but as a congregation gathered to restore a sacred place. Abigail, expecting to direct them, found herself a revered but gently sidelined figure. These men, who had spent their lives building barns and fences, knew what they were doing. They worked with a quiet, focused energy, tearing down the rotten, waterlogged planks and laying a new, solid foundation. By mid-morning, the women arrived. They came in a small, hesitant procession, led by the blacksmith's wife. They carried baskets of fresh bread, a pot of hot, savory stew, and a jug of cider. They set up a makeshift table, their actions a silent, powerful apology for the weeks of shunning. They spoke to Abigail in soft, respectful tones, asking about her plans for the new school, inquiring after Mr. Kane's health. They were rebuilding a bridge, plank by plank, just as their husbands were rebuilding the school. From his window in the boarding house, Jedediah watched it all. He saw the structure take shape, stronger and truer than it had been before. He saw the men working together, their laughter occasionally carrying on the wind. He saw Abigail moving among them, a cup of cider in her hand, her face animated as she spoke with the blacksmith's wife, a genuine, unburdened smile touching her lips. She was the center of it, the quiet, gravitational force that had pulled this broken community together. And a deep, familiar ache settled in his soul. He did not belong here. He was a man of the empty spaces, of the silent plains and the lonely campfires. He was a creature of solitude, his habits worn into deep grooves by years of loss and flight. This world of shared meals and easy camaraderie was a foreign country. He felt like a ghost watching a life he could never be a part of. He had stood with them in the fight, but he could not join them in the peace. Peace was a language he had forgotten how to speak. The old instinct, the one that had been his only trusted companion for a decade, began to whisper to him, "Leave. Ride out before they see you don't fit. Go before you bring more trouble. Go before you have something else to lose." He had stayed. He had done the hard thing. He had faced down the bully and won her this small piece of ground. His job was done. Now, it was time to do the thing he was best at. A week later, the school was finished. It was a simple, sturdy building of fresh-cut pine that smelled of resin and new beginnings. His ribs had mended into a constant, dull ache, and the burn on his arm was beginning to heal. He was well enough to ride. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Abigail walked from the boarding house to the new school, her heart full. She carried her old leather satchel, the same one she had arrived with, containing her books and slates, ready for the first day of class in the new building. As she approached, she saw him. Jedediah was standing by the corral next to the school, saddling his horse. Her heart stopped. Every detail of the scene was achingly clear the way he moved, still stiff but with a grim determination. The methodical, familiar way he cinched the saddle, the set of his jaw, a mask of resolute sorrow. He was leaving, after everything, after the fight, after the whispered conversations in the dark, after the silent promise that had passed between them on the starlit ridge. He was still leaving. She walked toward him, the dust muffling her footsteps. He didn't turn until she was only a few feet away. When he saw her, and the satchel in her hand, a flicker of deep, profound pain crossed his face. "The school looks good," he said, his voice rough. "Thompson and his boys do good work." "They had a good reason," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "You gave them one." He finished with the saddle and turned to face her fully, leaning against the horse as if for support. "They'll be good to you now. Abigail, Higgins won't trouble you again, not for a long time. You have your place here. You've earned it." It was a farewell speech. The words were a knife in her heart. "And you," she asked, "where is your place?" He looked away, out at the vast, darkening plains that had always been his refuge. "My place isn't in one spot. It never has been. I'm not a man for towns, for fences. I'm a man who rides on." He looked back at her, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "I bring trouble. You've seen it. It's better for you, for everyone, if I'm just a memory." The old excuse, the noble sacrifice, but she saw through it now. She saw the fear in his eyes, not fear of a fight, but fear of a home, fear of a heart. She stood there, clutching the smooth handle of her satchel, the symbol of her own transient life, of her own constant readiness to flee. She had won the town, but she was about to lose the world. Quietly, her voice trembling but clear in the still evening air, she asked the question that held the weight of everything they had been through, everything they could be. "Are you staying?" He went still, the cool evening breeze ruffling his hair. He looked at her, at the hope and the fear warring in her beautiful, honest eyes. He saw the woman who had faced down his ghosts and her own, who had mended the broken pieces of his past, who had shown him that staying could be a braver act than riding away. The old whispers, the ingrained habits of a lifetime, screamed at him to mount the horse and go. But a new voice, her voice, whispered something else. A slow, weary, miraculous smile touched his lips. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers gently brushing her cheek. "All night," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer name. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, a tear escaping to trace a path through the dust on her cheek. It was enough. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Then he added, his voice dropping to a raw, vulnerable whisper she had never heard from him before. "As long as you'll have me." Her eyes flew open. He was not offering her a night. He was offering her a life. He was not patching a hole. He was laying a foundation. Slowly, with a sense of reverence, of coming home after a journey that had lasted her entire life, Abigail lowered her arm. She set her leather satchel down in the dust at her feet. She let it go, and for the first time, under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the prairie sky, she truly believed she had found the one place she belonged. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help share it with more listeners like you.